Welcome to Florida Conversations. My name is Ashley Morrow, the program manager at Tampa's Black History Museum. And I'm glad you are all here to join us. Whether you're here in person or tuning in via Zoom, we appreciate you being part of this free and accessible event. Today is Wednesday, February 19th, 2025, and we have a fantastic program lined up just for you. Before we dive in, we'd like to extend a big thank you to our generous sponsors, USF Libraries, WUSF Public Media, and the AARP Tampa Bay. We're also grateful for the additional support from Shelley Blood and the Lorenzo Mollet family. Your contributions make this program possible. A full recording of today's discussion will be available on the Tampa Bay History Center YouTube channel. So if you'd like to revisit anything or share with others, you'll have that opportunity. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, and we'd love to hear from you. For those here in Tico Hall, please wait for the microphone before your question. For those on Zoom, you can submit your questions anytime using the Q&A feature in the web app. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the program.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Tampa Bay History Center. My name is Malika Hollist. I'm the brand manager for Arts Access Florida at WUSF. Arts Access Florida is a website that focuses on the Florida cultural organizations and is the home of our podcast, Happy Medium, and Jazz at WUSF. Am I too quiet? Oh, there it is. Okay. Thank you for coming out this evening to learn about the Chitlin Circuit and its role in our community. The circuit played an important part in the social fabric and culture of our community during widespread segregation and holds a special place in music, dance, and the history of Tampa. Our panel will be here to tell you more about that tonight. I have a lot of people I would like to thank, so just bear with me. First, I want to thank Fred Hearns and Nancy Dallins. Fred is the curator of Black History, and Nancy is the curator of education here at the Tampa Bay History Center. They warmly welcomed us into their space this evening, and we are so thankful for their partnership and grateful to put out this event tonight. Also, I'd like to thank the Hillsborough County Arts Council for the funding to produce this evening's panel. Also to Martine Collier, Lisa Hill, and Eileen Blake, thank you for all your help. And a special thanks to Warren Buckles. Warren is the WSF Jazz brand manager. He had a vision for this event. He worked very passionately on it, and I wanted to take a moment to thank him and just really appreciate all the hard work he has done. And last but not least, I want to introduce and say our panelists and moderator, Eric Deggans. Yay. Okay. Eric Deggans is NPR's first full-time TV and media critic and local jazz musician. Arthenia Joyner. She is a civil rights activist, attorney, and senator. Michelle Scott. Historian of American music and jazz age America. And Sharon Preston Fulta. She is an author and award-winning filmmaker. So thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoy, and let's start.
All right. Is this thing on? Okay. Sorry. So welcome. As was noted, my name is Eric Deggans, and I'm TV critic, media analyst, and guest host for P.A.R. I just happen to live in St. Petersburg, and so whenever WUSF needs a hand, they give me a call and I come running. So I'm happy to moderate this panel on the Chitlin Circuit in general, and the Chitlin Circuit in Florida, and the Chitlin Circuit in the Tampa Bay area. There's such a rich history. And you know, given the current climate and discussion about Black history, I just want to give a special shout out to everybody who was involved in making this program happen, because it is so important that we keep telling these stories, that we keep honoring folks like Arthenia and our other panelists, and that we never forget the lessons that Black history has for us about how things went down in the state and how we can make things better. So thank you, WUSF, and thank you all the sponsors who made this possible. We really appreciate it. So I'm sitting next to Arthenia Joyner. I mean, former state senator, first Black female lawyer in Hillsborough County, practiced law longer than any other Black woman in Florida. I mean, we could have a whole panel just about her, right? We're going to have to come back next Black History Month, and it's just going to be Arthenia night. So I'm particularly, I really want to talk to you about the Cotton Club and how you operated it with your father and all those things. But first, let's talk about this idea of chitlins and the circuit that was named for them. Because chitlins, to me, is like an example of how Black folks took something that was intended to be a punishment and turned it into something that was wonderful, right? And so now we have a circuit of performers that's named after chitlins. And I wanted to ask Michelle, I mean, is that the idea behind the term, the Chitlin Circuit? And talk a little bit about how the Chitlin Circuit kind of evolved nationwide.
Sure. So the Chitlin Circuit is named after the food and the delicacy that some soul food folks like. And it really refers to the fact that the circuit is named after this second tier level of theaters. So African Americans were part of performing in mainstream vaudeville circuits, which is what I study, the circuit that happens right before the Chitlin Circuit. But they couldn't necessarily perform in the Palace in New York City, but they could perform in the Palace Theater here in Tampa. And so the Chitlin Circuit is a collection of theaters, clubs, juke joints, nightclubs that cater to African American working class audiences, but also showcased African American performers. The circuit that precedes it in the 1920s, called the T.O.B.A Circuit, or the Theater Owners Booking Association, or T.O.B.A time, starts in 1920 and ends in the mid-1930s. And on that circuit, even though they're naming it as the second tier circuit that only African Americans can perform in, African American artists turned it into the foundation of live Black entertainment. So dancers, comedians, singers, vocalists, the foundations of jazz, blues, rock and roll are all appearing in the clubs in the Chitlin Circuit, and Tampa was one of the hubs.
All right. And so now, Arthenia, your dad operated the Cotton Club, which is a renowned establishment inside the Chitlin Circuit. And we also had the Manhattan Casino in St. Petersburg. So what do you remember about how the club operated and how it was the hub of entertainment, Black entertainment in Tampa when it was at its height?
My father, first, we lived in Lakeland, and we moved to Tampa in 1949 when he bought the Cotton Club. But prior to that time, he had a juke joint in Lakeland. And he decided that he wanted to come here and buy a place and have a really great place for Black people to go and entertain. Mm-hmm. So he bought the Cotton Club. Proud to say that he was the only Black person who actually owned his place. He was not renting. My father was a person who wanted to own everything that he could, and he did. I was 5, 6 years old, and my sister was a year older, my brother was a year younger, and we would run in and out of the club. And he would come home and say, X was there last night. He'd name somebody, and we didn't know who he was talking about. 5 years old. I didn't know anything about Donald Washington or Billie Holiday at 5 or 6. But as I grew older, then I began to understand that these were living, colorful Black entertainers who came to Tampa. And they performed mostly at the Apollo, which was a venue upstairs over the Rogers Dining Room, which was the Rogers Dining Room was the local eatery where you could get chitlins for 65 cents.
Mm.
And and uh, an expensive T-bone steak for $1.99.
Nowadays, you can't even get hot sauce for 65 cents.
And so what happened was the Cotton Club had a restaurant inside. You had to have on a coat and tie, and there was no violence was tolerated. People came dressed and ready to stroll on Central Avenue, and it was exciting because as a kid we would see these people all dressed up every weekend, and we'd stand outside. We were on the side of the Cotton Club watching because our parents took us to the bar and to the club, but they had a bedroom in the back for us rather than leave us home. And so we got an opportunity to see everybody in Tampa who came out on a Saturday night. But and I'm telling you, they were sharp. You know that we dressed. And so it was just a joy to see it. And in the daytime, you could go from Cass down to Henderson. And there would be the Florida Sentinel Bulletin with Mr. Andrews, and a Cozy Corner with Moses White. And we just had such a wonderful time seeing black people own everything on Central Avenue. Anything you wanted to be in life, it was there, even though segregation was the order of the day. So as I grew older, I remember Bobby Blue Bland coming to the Cotton Club. After he had performed somewhere else, they would come there, get a meal, and at times get up and provide us with some music. But the joy of meeting James Brown, oh my God. And today, and when I met him, and he was always Mr. Brown. He used titles. You did not call him James Brown. You called him Mr. Brown. And I was Miss Joyner. And as I grew older, the relationship was maintained through Alton, Andre, and Gerald White, whose father owned the Palm Dinette and the Cozy Corner. And so Mr. Brown sent me a box of albums autographed, and I still have them today. That was the utopia for me. And then, of course, the Tampa Alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta had a big social event every year, and it was the Queen of Hearts Ball. And this is where Ella Fitzgerald, I was too young then, I heard about it. But when I got to 11th grade, they had Ray Charles. So my mother said, I'm going to take you with me. And we showed up, and they said, you can't, she's a student. She can't come in here. This is for adults only. Well, we found a way. During that time, only black police officers could arrest black people. They could only arrest black people. So I knew all the police officers, and they were there at the armory guarding the doors. So when I showed up on the side with my mom, they let us in, and I got a chance to see Ray Charles perform in living color, and it was just wonderful as how old was I, 15, 16 years old, to see this giant of a man there. And I was, kind of hunchback because I didn't want my teacher to see me. But it was one of the joys of being a child of Central Avenue, because that's what I consider myself.
Do you know how close that was to when Ray Charles actually lived in the area? Was this many years after that, or?
It was after. It was after. Yeah, he had already been living here when I met him.
Wow. So Sharon, I wanted to talk to you a little bit because even though you worked for USF for many years, you were also Louis Armstrong's daughter, and your mom also worked on the Chitlin Circuit, right?
Absolutely. My mother and her husband were a dance team in Black Vaudeville called Slim and Sweets. And my mother got her start in Black Vaudeville through my Aunt Berta Lou, who was the captain of the chorus line at the Apollo Theater. So Aunt Berta Lou would be leading the chorus, and my mother's mother would prepare the food for all the chorus girls. My mother would bring it down to the Apollo and put the food down. Aunt Berta Lou said, get on the back line. And that's how she got into show business. My mother was a natural. She just enjoyed it. And from there, Aunt Berta Lou invited her to be a part of a cruise going to Buenos Aires. And at 16, that was her first professional job. And then when she got back, she met Slim, and Slim had just gotten out of the Army, and he was a dancer. And in those days, you know, people would just, I mean, the choices of jobs were limited for Black people. So domestic work, you know, preacher, religious, show business. And Slim and my mother just gravitated and had the natural talent. And they met each other. And Slim said to my mother, they're hiring in, I believe it was Texas, and they need a duo. You want to go? And they put the act together and created a dance and comedy act. And that was also a big part of the traveling show. They would have comedy teams and teams that did both dancing and comedy and singers and then the headliners. And so she traveled, Slim and Sweets would travel the circuit. And of course, my father, Louis Armstrong, was famous before the circuit, famous from New Orleans, but really became famous when he went to Chicago and then to New York during the Harlem Renaissance with Fletcher Henderson's band. But he would travel the circuit as the headliner. And what was great about the Chitlin Circuit, and I think really what helped all of the performers, is that they were all Black performers, no matter what level of skill that they had. They were all together, and they needed to be together because when they went out to travel, no matter how talented they was just Black performers. So from the new kid to the headliner, they all stayed together, ate, socialized, and they became family. And I think it all helped them to hone, their skills. So Mom and Slim danced through 1950 until Slim passed away.
Wow.
And I think, and you can correct me, I think the circuit kind of was dying around the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. And so, and I wanted to sort of piggyback on that idea of safety when I talk to you, Michelle, because, I hate to bring up Green Book, the movie, because I know that's controversial for some people, but the thing at the heart of that is a guide to places where Black folks could go and know that they would be safe. And I get the sense that the Chitlin Circuit was that for musicians and performers. At least you had a sense that if you got booked in these places, you wouldn't get run out on a rail. You could. So maybe you could elaborate on that a little.
Sure. Segregation made the circuit that much more difficult. It was also expensive to maintain segregation, right? So if you are a performer and you live in Chicago and you're attached to the circuit, and the T.O.B.A circuit has 100 theaters in the South, Southeast, and Midwest, and you need to get from Chicago all the way down to Tampa, and I think one of the railroad maps was showing in the background. Imagine having to do that in a troupe of 15, 16 people, and it's on a segregated railroad, right? You have to move equipment, you have to move bodies, personnel, luggage, costumes, and you have to do it in a manner efficiently and quietly, obeying the rules of segregation. And so some performers or singers, like Bessie Smith or Ma Rainey, would just lease out railroad cars for their whole troupe rather than try to ride the rails in terms of segregation levels and experience that humiliation. But then once you get from city to city, there needs to be something that tells you where you can eat, where you can sleep, where you can get your laundry done. And so the Green Book was really helpful for the Chitlin Circuit after 1936. But before 1936, there needed to be a guide particularly just for Black entertainers. And so they had something called the Official Colored Theatrical Guide that happens in 1928. And it tells you city by city, you can go to this boarding house in Chattanooga, you can get your laundry done, in this place in Tampa. You can go to Pensacola and find out a costumer there, and have to duplicate all of these services in each place. And still put on a show, sometimes 2 or 3 shows a night, right, within the week. So it wasn't just like the stage is your artistic refuge. You have to think about how you're going to live and survive in the meantime, going from city to city. And violence did break out, particularly in the early levels of the circuit, before you had some of the protections of the Black businesses that established to really protect entertainers. You have violence in the example of the Greenwood District and the Tulsa Massacre, where one of these early pre-Chitlin theaters was leveled to the ground in the middle of the massacre, right? So it was more than just an artistic dream to be on the circuit. You were often taking your life in your hands.
And Arthenia, I was wondering, did you experience at all having to help performers find places to stay, or sort of help them navigate the area when they came to your dad's establishment?
Not really, because the Rogers Hotel and the Jackson House, and some people had rooms in their homes who openly came out and said, I know you need somewhere to stay, and they would make arrangements with whoever had arranged for the entertainer to come to town. So we knew where they would go, because where they could go and live. And I remember the Jackson House, because Miss Robinson, I would go by there leaving school and stop and talk to her on occasions. And she would talk about who had stayed there and how she had provided the meals. And it was just a way of life that we knew that those were the only places they could go. And so she was such a wonderful, sweet lady who loved what she was doing, opening up her home to these entertainers. But I didn't have to interact with them, except we knew these are the places that you can go.
Right. So I know that there were clubs in the Chitlin Circuit in Jacksonville and Tallahassee, but what I found so interesting is that your dad's club was such a mecca, and even that area was known as the Harlem of the South, right?
Yeah.
So do you have any sense about why it flourished? And also, I mean, we had the Manhattan Casino in St. Pete, and that also flourished too. So 2 really important clubs within the same metro area.
Yes, well, the Cotton Club was just a premier place to go. If you were going to dress up on the weekend like we did and take the stroll down Central Avenue, you had to go to the Cotton Club.
All right, all
And,
right.
and because of the standard that my father had with the coat and the tie and the tablecloth on the tables, and that was different from most other places. So we had a reputation.
Did you have air conditioning?
Fans.
All right, all right. Because a lot of Chitlin Circuit places they didn't have air.
No, we had big fans in there, but it didn't matter. When the weekend came and the musicians came, the other thing that we had was we had a lot of local with the local circuit.
Mm-hmm.
And one person in particular was Charles Perry, who was a teacher, a coach. He was such an aficionado of jazz and all. He carried his equipment around with him, and he would come in and say, Mr. Joyner, can I plug in? He got the nickname of being plug in, because he would just plug in his equipment and open it all up. And my dad said, here he is again. I mean, he loved, but the music was wonderful. The people got up and danced and had a good time. They got a fifth pint and a setup, because during that day there was no drink by no liquor by the drink. You had to buy half a pint, or a fifth, and a bucket of ice and a chaser, ginger ale or Coke or whatever. But that was the way it was then, and you could also see when somebody was getting a little too tipsy and say that's enough, you know. So we don't want anybody leaving here getting in any trouble. And if they got a fifth, it was usually 4 or 5 people, and they would come and get a table and just have fun and have a meal. But I can assure you, my father was adamant about safety. He did not want any violence in the Cotton Club. Consequently, every now and then there'd be a bouncer to make sure, but we never needed them because the reputation of the Cotton Club as being the place to go was it, and people abided by it. And as a kid coming in every day after school and seeing everybody and sashaying in, oh, that's Mr. Joyner's daughter, that's his son. And so people treated us like we were their kid. You know, if we did anything wrong, Mr. Joyner knew. My mom would say, all right, you know how your daddy is. You better keep it on the straight and narrow. But so did Mr. Harris next door at Rogers' dining room, or Mr. Andrews, or Mr. White, if any of us acted up, any of the kids. Because behind Central was Central Park Village, the housing projects, which was the premier place for black people to live then. And it was wonderful, and you had friends, and the furniture was fabulous, the yards, because this was what we had, and we took care of it, and we loved it. And I just enjoyed being a child raised on Central Avenue.
There you go. It takes a village, right?
Yes.
So Sharon, I wanted to ask you now. You had an unusual relationship with your dad because he couldn't openly acknowledge that you were his daughter, and you've written a book about it, and there's been a documentary. Could you talk a little bit about that? And were you able to experience the Chitlin Circuit at all, or did that fractured relationship make it more difficult?
No, I was very fortunate that I didn't experience the Chitlin Circuit with him, but I did get to travel with him as a young child. So they had an arrangement, even though my parents didn't marry, he would spend time with us, and when I was very young, I would actually go on the road with my mother and he. So he was the first person that I actually saw perform live. I was in the audience or backstage, but I was, a toddler when I started seeing live shows. But I wrote the book because the relationship started after my mother's husband passed away in 1950. My mother and Louis and his wife and Slim, they were all friends. As I said, they all hung out together, they traveled together, they worked several times together, but the friendship became more after Slim passed away, and they began their relationship. And, I did not experience them together outside of us traveling, but they lasted throughout the rest of his life. And, he supported us, and I got to experience him through audio letters, through written letters, and their relationship, they made it work the best they could, but it was disappointing for my mother that it didn't end in marriage as she had hoped it would. But he did take care of us. But I was very fortunate, as I said, to actually get to see him perform. And when we traveled, so now it's the 1960s, and at this point, my father had integrated hotels. So when we went on the road with him, we stayed in very nice hotels. There was never any problems. The band was an integrated band. We did have one time on the road where we were traveling, and I talk about this in the book, where my father and I just happened to be sitting and hanging back in the bus, and two young white men walked by the bus, and his name was on the bus, and one said to the other, "Oh wow, that's Louis Armstrong," and the other one commented, "Yeah, but he's just another N-word." And and it was an experience. I had very few of those life moments with my father, but that was one where he looked at me and he said, "In this life, there will always be people, no matter how big you are, that see you that way." So, we did not have problems, and life on the road with him was excellent. The band, they were wonderful to us, but he never forgot who he was. He was never really allowed to forget. He just worked through it and did it in his way.
Oh, and can you tell the folks the name of the book?
The name of the book is Little Satchmo, and the name of the documentary is Little Satchmo. And I decided to write the book. I was in my 50s, and I was already a grandmother, and I had kind of grappled with the fact that it was the family secret, but, kind of a bad secret where everybody in your family knows, your friends know, but it really wasn't out there in the public. But I was just at a place where, I wanted to kind of define my legacy. And I came to a place where I knew that I had to tell my story, but I wasn't sure how. So at that time, I was seeing a therapist, and she directed me to an estate attorney. So I took a copy of one of the letters to the estate attorney, and he reviewed it, and he said, "Oh, definitely authentic." He goes, "But I bet you the people who are running his estate definitely crossed their T's and dotted their I's. So if you want to know any information, you really need to read the will. And if you want to read the will, I could tell you that there should be one filed in surrogate court, because they would file one in surrogate court just in case there was any kind of paternity suit." So I said, okay. So he passed away in Queens. He lived in Queens. And I went to the Queens surrogate court. Now, all of my life, it's the family secret, and my mother was really guarded about telling this secret. So here I am now going to read his will, something that was kept from me. And I'm there, and I walk up to the gentleman, and I ask for the will. And he just looks at me, and right away I'm like, "Oh no, my gosh, what's he going to do?" But I take the will and I put it through the microfiche machine, and I'm reading, and I see some familiar names of people that I know, like his accountant and different people throughout his life that worked with Mom and I. And then I came to the affidavit that his wife signed, saying that he had no children, but actually crossed out some of the legalese and put the word no. And just in that moment, because of that edit, I really fully understood how I had been legally erased, and understood that it wasn't about any legality, but it was about my voice and being known as existing. And that's when I made up my mind that if my story was going to be told, I was the one that had to tell it. So at that point, that's when the work started. And I found an entertainment lawyer who helped me find a literary agent, who helped me find a co-author. And then I took about 3 years to decide how I wanted to tell the story, and realized that, because my father wrote so many letters to so many people, and especially Mom and I, and also audio letters, that the letters kind of chronicled where they were in the relationship. And taking the letters and my memories, I put that together. and with Deneen Milner's beautiful words, took my words, kept my voice, and then we published the memoir.
Wow, that's amazing.
And then I would say about 7 years later, I met Leah Umberger, who was a local producer here and adjunct professor here, and she was running a local arts festival in St. Pete. We became friends, and I gave her a copy of my book. And 2 years after that, she called me and said, "I love your story. I know how to produce, but I've never produced a film, but if you trust me, I would like to produce your film, become into a documentary, and I have a director in mind."
Wow.
And she introduced us to John Alexander and J.C. Guest, who had just made a film about a blues legend called Rudy Love, a forgotten blues legend, but well known to musicians, but not known in the world. And his film had premiered around the world, and it was she was hosting it at a small, intimate festival here in St. Pete, at a place called the Hideaway. That's not
Yeah,
in
it doesn't
existence
exist
anymore.
anymore, yeah.
But she was doing a monthly film festival of films about musicians, and we all met, and then that's how it came to be.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, and yeah, exactly. And what struck me is that Louis Armstrong played the Manhattan Casino in '57,
Yes.
and we all know, or many of us know, that Ray Charles spent some time living here and recorded one of his first songs in living in Tampa called St. Pete Blues. And so, Michelle, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I know you don't necessarily know a lot of local stuff. But I'm wondering, I mean, we have these two clubs. It seems kind of unusual to me that we would have these two clubs that were so successful on the Chitlin Circuit, so close to each other in the same metro area, with these legendary performers who have come there. And I would wonder if you might want to hazard a guess as to why it turned out that way. How did we get so lucky?
So Florida in general, and Tampa more specifically, was one of the hubs of the early theaters before the T.O.B.A. circuit gets started. So even in the 19th century, somebody like Pat Chappelle, who here had the Buckingham Theater Saloon in Fort Brooke neighborhood, is starting one of the first African Americans to own his own theater and showcase black performers. And not just being the performer himself, but owning the actual building and helping the idea of a circuit. So the idea is really born here in Florida, as well as in Tennessee, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And so it happens, and luck and happenstance, that you have all of these leaders of the idea of a theater circuit being here in Florida. So one of the slides that went by was showing you a slide of a Sadie Goodson, who was a blues pianist who gets her start in Pensacola when she fills in for a sick piano player for Bessie Smith, right? And so she is trained as a hymnal performer, a religious performer, right? But she's also performing at the same time as someone like Thomas Dorsey, who is the composer of Precious Lord. So in the middle of the circuit, both those folks are known as George or Tom, right? And so they're playing dirty blues music, like, if you want to hear a song like It's Tight Like That, it has nothing to do with Precious Lord. Nothing to do with it. But the location of these theaters and their performers, where they're being born and how they're kind of learning arts education, happens to all be here in Florida as one of the hubs. So you're lucky that, within, 30, 40 miles of each other, everything is right here. And then once the Chitlin Circuit gets started, you continue on with that same proximity to transportation and the folks who are organizing the circuits.
Right.
I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that we had great local artists. Kenneth Nurse, Ernie Cowles, Miss Kitty, who recently died. She was wonderful with jazz. She performed at the Cotton Club many a night, and she was performing at Donatello's 2 weeks before she died. And then there was Manzi Harris, who had a 5-person combo, and they did jazz and rock and roll. And in that group was a man called Johnny Madding, and he played the bass fiddler, and he played with other big bands in the area, black and white. And so, because we had, music and all of these artists in our town, it was only natural that Tampa would be one of the places, notwithstanding the fact that St. Pete was a stone's throw across the river, across the bridge. We were just blessed that we had all this immense black talent that covered every genre of music, and the people benefited from it. And Tampa has never looked back. Ray Charles writing that song about St. Pete living in Tampa, but he lived here, and now we have an apartment complex and all, a street named for him. And so Tampa has just been in the music mix forever. And I remember Hank Ballard and the Midnighters and Fats Domino and Sam Cooke. All those people came and performed in this town. So Tampa has been the beneficiary of all of the great black entertainers.
So now we're going to start taking questions from the crowd very soon. So you guys put on your thinking caps. Think about how you're going to challenge our august panel here. And, Arthenia, when we were talking before everything started, we talked about how you could be living history and not realize that you're living history. And it seemed like maybe that was the case with you and the Cotton Club, that you were in the middle of all of this historic stuff that was happening, but for you guys, it was just another Tuesday or Wednesday, right?
Yes. And so often we take things for granted. I know when the Honorable Peggy Quince became the first black and the only black woman, the first black woman on the Florida Supreme Court. And I would tell all the young lawyers that whenever she spoke, get a picture. This is history. Because at that point in time, I realized it because I blew it by not having pictures with Rosa Parks, even though I met her in Washington, D.C. at the Congressional Black Caucus for many years. So you have to think about it and what does this activity or this person have that may be historic. I mean, and just take pictures with your friends. Don't do like back in the day, we didn't take a lot of pictures. We had a black photographer on Central Avenue, MacArthur, and everybody went for Christmas and Easter and took pictures. But we did not, we had a Brownie Hawkeye camera, but that was about the extent of it. So don't let the opportunity pass you by that you're in the midst of history and you miss your opportunity to be a part of it.
Now, I heard that there was a certain dance craze that got started by a man named Chubby Checker, but was inspired by folks dancing on Central Avenue. Is that true?
Well, that's what the conventional wisdom is. Frances Cheeks is from Tampa, and she's West Tampa. She said, yes, it's true.
Yeah. So the twist was invented right here in the Tampa Bay area. So if somebody on Central Avenue, so if somebody asks you, did you learn something? That's what you learned. All right. So now, Arthenia, I wanted to ask you. So the Cotton Club closed in '74.
Yes.
And can you give us a sense about why that happened? What happened?
Well, urban renewal, which I call urban removal, happened. Came down from the federal government through the process called eminent domain, where the government can take your property if it's for a public purpose. And so Interstate 4 was being built, and that wiped out Central Avenue. And it was devastating. All of the black businesses in one fell swoop were gone. And so everybody was moving out and negotiating with the government, and every day somebody was going and looked up and Central was bare except the Cotton Club was still open. And I asked my dad why, and he said, because I'm not going to give up my property until I get what I know it is worth. And so we were the last one to leave. He was the last man standing on Central Avenue. And that's the way it was then, and it happens now with eminent domain. And I can just advise you, don't sign a thing. Get your lawyer and fight it.
That's right. Yeah, we were. I was just at the Collard Green Festival in St. Pete on Saturday, which took place a block south of Manhattan Casino, and that huge overpass is looming over everything as sort of a symbol of how that neighborhood also got, demolished, and black people got displaced by yet another interstate.
All over the country.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Michelle, I wanted to ask you. We mentioned the Cotton Club closed in '74. Manhattan Casino closed in '68. Are we seeing, because segregation breaks down and black performers can now play in, places where white people go, and they can stay in hotels where white people go? Is that part of what sort of leached the energy out of the Chitlin Circuit, and is that why we saw it go away?
You never really see a full decline of the circuit. You see those spaces definitely being eradicated by urban renewal, by recession, inflation in the 1970s in general, by the a political turn that happens in the 1980s. But what you start to see is a resurgence of not the exact same physical spaces, but you start to see a need for those spaces to redevelop in another way when you're talking about like early black theater, for example. So before Tyler Perry becomes Tyler Perry, the Chitlin Circuit was a black theater circuit that starts in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And you're going from church to church, club to club. Some of the Chitlin Circuit clubs or spaces might be refurbished and turned to a place where it would hold these small black theater performances. You'll also start to see a resurgence in some of the clubs holding comedy performance, comedy acts. And even now, there are 3 theaters still standing left from the T.O.B.A circuit that then became the Chitlin Circuit. So one is in Washington, D.C., the Howard Theater. One is actually in Indianapolis, the Madam C.J. Walker Center Theater. Yeah, and then one is actually in Macon, Georgia, the Douglas Theater. And there's still active live theaters that showcase black performers, but performers of all kinds. But they are aware of their legacy on the Chitlin Circuit, right? So I think there are a lot of spaces that closed and they weren't aware of their importance and their significance in the history. And so that's why there is this period of a physical decline, but like an absence from the memory of what the Chitlin Circuit meant to these performances.
And so even when segregation kind of breaks down and it's possible to reach mixed audiences, there's still a need for black-centered entertainment in a place where black people can see it and the culture can be distilled. Is that what we're seeing?
There's still a need for it in terms of community building and arts development, but there's also a need for it in terms of the financial inability to go to a concert, right? So if you're thinking about concerts now that are broadcast largely to audiences all over the place, like the latest Taylor Swift, the latest Beyonce concert. You might really want to go to that concert, but you might really not have the money to do so, right? But if your favorite act might be playing in an after hours club, or you hear about a jam session that's happening that is, a quarter of the price, then those spaces tend to be minority owned or African American owned, and you might still be able to get a glimpse of your favorite performer, right? So you might not be able to see when Prince was with us, a Prince show, but you could go to Paisley Park and see an after-hours jam session, right? So there's still a need for those spaces, even though the legality of segregation ends in the late 1960s. The community building part that fosters in the middle of this racial divide is something that continues despite that end legally.
And, as somebody who paid to have 4th row seats to see Prince when he was at Amalie Arena, I think I would have preferred a jam session, to be honest. So we're going to start taking questions from the crowd. So we got somebody with a mic, Oprah style. So raise your hand if you have a question. We got somebody with a question right here. And as you guys kind of get the mic to her, I want to ask Sharon real quick. What was your experience in seeing the decline of the Chitlin Circuit from the perspective of your parents? Did you see that happen as you were growing up with them?
I did not. It had declined. My mother left show business in 1950, and by the time she was leaving, a lot of the opportunities to perform had dissipated. She was in the group of friends with Coles and Atkins, the Nicholas brothers, and those to, had more opportunities in the movies. But Mom and other groups like Buck and Bubbles and, and acts that weren't as well known, they didn't have as many opportunities. So places like the Apollo, um, they were able to pay the acts low wages, and they were able to turn over shows. But by the time they got to the 50s and 60s, the acts were costing more. They weren't able to do as many shows. Tastes were changing in entertainment. So I think that had more to do with, her being able to travel and be a part of the circuit.
Right. Makes sense. Okay. Let's take our first question.
My name is Francis Teach James. One thing that Arthenia failed to mention was that her father we were all members of the same church. He would allow the kids to come and watch the movie stars, the musicians and all. We would be allowed to stand outside. We would know when they were coming, we would know when they were going, and we would be allowed to talk to them, and some of them would even sign little cards for us and things like that. So the community was involved in what went on in Central Avenue, although we say Central Avenue, and some of you may remember Central Avenue, remember that Toka did, that the children and entire community was involved with Central Avenue, including the children, and how the owners of those different restaurants and those entertainments, they would make sure that we as black children, well, Negro, black, colored, whatever we are, African American now, right. But whatever we were in, that we had the things that we needed because of the times of segregation, and how the philanthropy that the people who own all these restaurants on Central Avenue contributed to the community through the singers and all those who came through Central Avenue.
Mm. Well, there you go. All right. Anybody else? Got a question over here. Yes.
I'm good.
Well, we have people watching over Zoom. They won't hear you if you don't. Yeah.
Good evening, and what a wonderful evening of rich history, of especially learning the degree of what the Chitlin Circuit meant. So thank you all for that. Little Satchmo, I was just wondering, after the erasure in the written documents, did the family ever evolve to a very loving relationship with you openly?
No, they did not. The only person left was his wife, and she passed in 1985, and I really did not pursue, my legacy until was it 2000 or 1999? So there was no family left. It was the association by that time, the Educational Foundation. And I did not get in touch with them to have a conversation about it. I wanted to pursue it on my own. And then once it was complete, then meet with them, and that's how it turned out. Also, a family friend is the vice president of the Educational Foundation. So once it was published, she actually reached out to me, and I met with the head of the Louis Armstrong House at that time, which was Michael, I'll think of his name, but Ricky Riccardi, who is still there, is the archivist, and I met with him. And we've, had discussions, and I've been at the house and toured the archives with them, but there is no, I would say, friendly relationship, although at this point in time, they have mentioned me in the blogs of the Louis Armstrong House, and they actually have a link to our documentary website in one of their articles, which is my mother and I sent my father a Christmas card, which he kept, and he had many, many reel-to-reel recordings, whether they were of concerts, of conversations, of other artists performing, and he labeled the tape with different artwork that he created, and he used one of our Christmas cards to label the tape. So there's a blog about each cover of all the tapes that he has, and they explain that the card came from my mother and I, and it's like, yes, he had a daughter, and he talks about it, and if you want to know more about her, here's her website. So that's what I got.
I guess that's better than nothing. Huh? Anybody else? Right here, we've got somebody right here. Oh, hold on. Wait till we get a mic to you.
I'm coming. Price is right.
I did, but we got to get a mic to you because there's people watching over Zoom and they won't hear you
She
if you
knows
don't.
I talk a lot. So,
Yeah.
Arthenia, I was so engaged by the fact that you said the local artist here in Tampa is what really fueled the Chitlin Circuit and all the performers that came here. And it just reminded me, I hope you watched the Grammys recently when a Tampa artist got a Grammy and her message was, music producers, come to Tampa. Did you not love that?
Right. A lot of talent here.
Yeah, that's always, I first moved here in 1995 to be the pop music critic for the St. Petersburg Times. And when I moved here, there were 3 local acts that had major label record deals. And Morrisound, the studio in Tampa, was doing a ton of recording of death metal acts and stuff from people were coming from Germany and Europe to record here. And I always wondered why the music industry didn't pay more attention to this city because there was obviously a ton of stuff going on and there still is. Just another example of the great talent that's here that affects everything nationwide, Anybody else? Go ahead.
Hi.
Well, she'll go and then we'll get you.
I'm
Go
on?
ahead.
Okay. Hi, I think might be for Professor Scott. I'm curious about the venues on the circuit. Were they all African American? Were they all black-owned clubs that were on the circuit?
So on the T.O.B.A circuit, no, they weren't all African American owned. There are 100 different theaters. About 30 out of the 100 are owned by African Americans. So it was a predominantly white-owned circuit. And that mixture of white was first-generation Jewish immigrant as well as native-born white. It was also interesting to me to look at the fact that not all the theaters were owned by men. So there are women, black and white women, who are owning theaters on the circuit. And it was like a momentary interracial cooperation in terms of the business that even at the top level for a theater that was performing in the segregated circuit with segregated audiences, that you had an exchange of the financial top. And you can see it in their correspondence back and forth about how they're going to schedule acts and how people are going to get paid. So it was definitely an interracially owned circuit.
We had somebody over here. Yeah, right here.
Hi, I've got a question for Ms. Joyner. I'm a journalist in Lakeland, and would really love to hear your recollections of growing up in Lakeland, the music scene there at the time, and just what life was like for you there.
Sorry to disappoint you, but we left Lakeland when I was 5. The most that I remember was the night that the Ku Klux Klan marched. And my dad came home and said, pull on the shades and lock the doors. And I was frightened. And he said, and I wanted to know why. And he said, because of the color of your skin, that there's prejudice and discrimination. But don't worry, I'll protect you. That is what I remember most about Lakeland. And but I do have lots of relatives there. It is home. I was born on Memorial Boulevard. It was North Street then. And it was a segregated time in America. And that's the way it was. Yeah. But it's still where I was born. But I am a product, really, of Tampa.
And I'll tell you, my only story about Lakeland is when I covered Jerry Springer bringing his show to Lakeland in the 1990s, which was interesting.
This is also for Senator Joyner to piggyback on what you just said, because we're in scary times again. What advice would you give us when we are scared?
Well, black people have always persevered.
That's right.
We have been at the very bottom, and nothing ever stopped us. It's this new generation and some older folks who don't know what it's like to be at the very bottom. But at the rate that we are going, before it's over, they will all feel what it's like to have been marginalized merely because of the color of your skin. Now it's because you don't have any money, you're poor, and folks don't think that you're worth anything. But together, we can make a difference, and we've got to stand up and fight.
Before we wrap, I do want to ask my other two panelists, starting with Michelle, any lessons that we can learn for the current moment from the Chitlin Circuit's rise and decline?
I think we are in scary times. We're in scary times for the profession that I chose to be a part of in terms of archiving and preserving and talking about the Black past. But because I study a period of heightened segregation and heightened racial violence, historians refer to it as the nadir, or the lowest point in race relations between African Americans and whites in the 20th century. I learned the lessons that Senator Joyner mentioned about perseverance and resilience of communities of color, but also reaching across a color line and a gender line, actually, to stand together in terms of resistance and not let outside forces define who you are, and to remember the importance of your history, all of our histories, right? This is a time where you can tell that history is powerful when someone wants to deny you access to an archive, right? That shows you the power in it. And something like the Chitlin Circuit, even discussing, the power of the leisure, the love, the community is also a form of resistance, right? It's not always protest. It's not always speeches and sermons. Sometimes it's living and thriving in the midst of difficult periods of time. And the Chitlin Circuit helped folks to do that.
And Sharon, it seemed like you kind of reclaimed your power by reclaiming your history. Is that the lesson that perhaps we can take for this moment from your story?
Absolutely. Just understand that everyone has a story, everyone has a right to tell their story, and no matter what your story is, there is no need to be ashamed of it. It is what it is. And until you acknowledge your truth, you won't have any personal strength. You just need to acknowledge who you are in the moment, be thankful, and move on and have the strength in that, in the acknowledgement. Because it's when we kind of hide away and make details what they're not or ignore them, that's when we have problems. And for me, understanding my story from the point of my parents, where growing up, I always blamed Lucille, his wife, for them not being together. But it wasn't until I just took time to understand my father, my mother, and the people that they were surrounded with, the times that they lived in, that I understood that it was no one person's fault, especially not mine.
There you go. There you go. Well, I want to thank our illustrious panelists for joining us. I want to thank you guys for coming out in the rain. And I don't know where you got parking, but thank you for persevering and parking your car and coming in and joining us. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a little intermission where you can go out and enjoy some of that wonderful food and maybe buy some more artwork from my man in the back. And then we'll have a band. We're going to have some music, because you can't talk about the Chitlin Circuit and not have some music. So please stick around, enjoy the food out there, come back here in just a few minutes, and you can hear a wonderful musical performance.
There's a play entitled When the Righteous Triumph. It's scheduled for March the 6th through the 15th at the Straz. This play it's a depiction of the 1960, February 29th, 1960 sit-ins at downtown Tampa, Woolworths. and there were 20 black students from Middleton and 20 black students from Blake who came down, sat in, and demanded to be served, which eventually led to Tampa opening all of its department stores downtown as a result of the leadership of the mayor, Julian Lane, Reverend A. Leon Lowry, the state NAACP president, and a young man, Cody Fowler, a lawyer, a white lawyer, who was the chair of the biracial committee, and a young man by the name of Clarence Fort, the NAACP Youth Council president, who came up with the idea after North Carolina and Tennessee. And this was the first month of the sit-ins at lunch counters in 1960, and it came to Tampa. I was one of those students from Middleton, and we did not encounter any violence, and that was the Tampa technique, and it was the only one in the nation that successfully was able to integrate the lunch counters without any violence, and that occurred 4 or 5 weeks later. So please support the play, because it too is history, and you need to know that story, and that's why it's being told in the form of that play led by Stageworks, which had it in 2023, but now it's a Stageworks Straz partnership. So please go online to either the Straz or Stageworks and purchase your tickets. Thank you.